The prison was quiet. Not peaceful. Not calm. Just heavy. Stone walls absorbed sound. Iron bars swallowed light. The air felt older than memory. And somewhere in the dimness of that Egyptian cell sat a young Hebrew man who once dreamed of greatness. His name was Joseph. And if you saw him there, dusty, forgotten, stripped of status, you would never guess he carried a dream from God. But that dream was the reason he was there. We love to say, when God gives you a dream, everything will align. Joseph would disagree, because sometimes the dream is not the reward. Sometimes the dream is the disruption. What if the thing God showed you is the very thing that causes everything to fall apart first? Joseph didn't start in prison. He started in promise. He was 17 when heaven interrupted his ordinary life. 17, still young enough to be innocent, old enough to believe everything God shows must happen soon. He dreamed. In the first dream, sheaves of grain in a field bowed down to his sheaf. In the second dream, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. It wasn't vague. It wasn't symbolic in a small way. It was dominance, elevation, authority. And Joseph made a mistake many dreamers make. He told everyone. He told his brothers. He told his father. He told the very people who would one day bow. And what was meant to inspire faith ignited resentment instead. Because not everyone celebrates your calling. Some people experience your destiny as a threat. Joseph didn't understand that yet. He thought the dream was good news. He didn't realize it was a spotlight. And spotlights create shadows. His father, Jacob, already favored him. Gave him a coat unlike the others. Not because Joseph earned it. Not because he was stronger. But because he was chosen. Favor without explanation breeds tension. The coat wasn't just fabric. It was announcement. And the brothers saw it. Every day. Every time Joseph walked into a room. Every time Jacob looked at him differently. Now imagine hearing your younger brother say, "I had a dream. And you bowed to me." Even if he didn't mean it arrogantly, it felt like arrogance. Even if he didn't mean harm, it felt like insult. Dreams reveal hierarchy. And nobody enjoys hearing they will stand lower. That's when the problem began. Not with the pit. Not with Egypt. Not with prison. With a dream. Joseph didn't ask for the dream. He didn't design it. He didn't manufacture ambition. God initiated it. And that's what makes this story unsettling. Because it means God sometimes shows you something glorious. Without warning you about the cost. No disclaimer. No roadmap. Just revelation. Joseph probably imagined leadership. He did not imagine betrayal. He likely pictured elevation. He did not foresee isolation. He saw stars bowing. He did not see chains closing. The dream was accurate, but incomplete. An incomplete revelation can be dangerous if you assume it includes comfort. Back to the prison. Years later, Joseph would sit on cold stone remembering those dreams. Did he question them? Did he replay them? Did he wonder if he misunderstood? Because reality contradicted everything. Dream, authority. Reality, captivity. Dream, family bowing. Reality, family gone. Dream, elevation. Reality, humiliation. When God speaks about your future, he rarely explains the middle. Joseph's middle would include a pit, a caravan, a slave market, a false accusation, a prison cell, silence. But at 17, all he saw was glory. And here's the psychological tension. Dreams from God are seeds. But seeds must be buried before they rise. Joseph thought the dream would lift him. Instead, it buried him. And burial feels like contradiction. There's something else. The dream exposed him. Before the dream, he was simply a favored son. After the dream, he was a target. The dream revealed the direction of his destiny. And in doing so, revealed the insecurity of others. The dream didn't change who he was. It changed how others saw him. That's the beginning of many callings. You become misunderstood, not because you did wrong, but because you carry something others cannot yet accept. Joseph's brothers stopped seeing him as brother. They started seeing him as threat. The dream divided the house. And Joseph didn't even know he was stepping into war. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because we like to believe obedience guarantees safety. Joseph didn't rebel. He didn't run away. He didn't disobey God. He simply received a dream. And that dream destabilized his world. What if your disruption is not evidence you missed God, but evidence you encountered him? The dream was the beginning of the problem, but it was also the beginning of the process. Because before Joseph could govern Egypt, he had to survive misunderstanding. Before he could manage abundance, He had to endure loss. Before others could bow, he had to kneel. In that prison cell, years later, Joseph would look back and realize something shocking. The dream didn't fail him. It led him. Every painful turn connected. Every betrayal redirected. Every silence strengthened. But in the beginning, none of that was visible. At 17, he only knew this. God showed me something big. And suddenly, everything feels unstable. That is the tension of calling. Heaven speaks. Earth reacts. And you stand in the middle wondering what just happened. Joseph's story does not start with chains. It starts with vision. And sometimes vision is more dangerous than limitation. Because once you've seen what could be, ordinary life feels smaller. And once others sense you carry something beyond them, they respond. Not always with applause. Often with resistance. The prison was quiet. But it wasn't random. It was connected to a dream. The pit wasn't accidental. The betrayal wasn't outside the story. The silence wasn't abandonment. The dream was the beginning of the problem. But it was also the beginning of destiny. Joseph didn't know it yet. He thought his life was falling apart. He didn't realize it was rearranging. And that's where our story truly begins. Before the pit. Before the chains. Before the prison walls and palace floors. There was a coat. It's easy to talk about betrayal. It's dramatic. It bleeds. But favor? Favor is quieter, and sometimes more dangerous. Joseph's story did not begin with rejection. It began with preference. Jacob loved him differently. The Bible doesn't soften it. It doesn't say slightly more. It doesn't imply subtlety. It states it plainly. Joseph was loved more than his brothers. He was the son of Rachel, the long-awaited, deeply desired wife. The miracle child of a love story that had been complicated from the beginning. And love, when expressed unevenly, can become a spark in dry grass. Joseph did not ask to be the favorite, but he wore it. The household of tension. Imagine the atmosphere inside Jacob's camp. 12 sons. Different mothers. Layers of rivalry already embedded in the family system long before Joseph could speak. Leah competing with Rachel. Maidservants used as bargaining tools. Birth order politics. Unspoken resentment. This was not a calm, unified home. It was a fragile alliance. Joseph grew up in that tension. He was 17, young enough to be idealistic, old enough to understand he stood out. He worked alongside his brothers in the fields. He saw how they behaved. He reported back to his father when they acted irresponsibly. Some call it tattling. Some call it integrity. Either way, it didn't make him popular. Favor isolates. When one person is highlighted, others feel dimmed. And Joseph, without fully understanding the cost, stepped further into the spotlight. The coat that announced it. Jacob gave him a special garment. A richly ornamented robe. A coat of many colors. Or, more accurately, a long-sleeved tunic that signaled distinction. In that culture, clothing wasn't fashion. It was function. Field workers wore short, practical garments. Leaders and overseers wore long robes. This coat wasn't just beautiful. It was symbolic. It said, "You are different. You are set apart. You are not like them." And his brothers saw it. Every day, when Joseph walked past, the fabric moved like a declaration. It shimmered in the sun. It whispered to them, "He is preferred." Favor is visible, and visibility can provoke. Joseph may have seen it as love. His brothers saw it as inequality, and the tension thickened. The dream that made it worse. Then came the dreams. Joseph dreamed of sheaves of grain in a field. His brothers' sheaves bowed down to his. He told them. He dreamed again. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing to him. He told them that too. Now pause. Was Joseph arrogant? Or was he simply honest? Scripture doesn't label him as prideful. It presents him as young, perhaps naive. He believed what he saw. He assumed others would receive it the same way. But dreams without timing can sound like boasting. When you are already favored, and then you speak of future authority, it feels like insult layered on injury. His brothers didn't just dislike him anymore. They hated him. The coat made him different. The dream made him threatening. The weight of calling. Here's the part most people miss. Calling often arrives before character is fully shaped. Joseph was chosen, but he wasn't mature yet. He was destined, but he was still developing. The dream was real. The destiny was real. The future authority was real. But the process had not yet begun. Favor without process creates friction. God sometimes shows you where you're going long before you're ready to arrive. Not to inflate you, but to anchor you. Joseph needed something to hold on to in the pit, something to cling to in the prison, something to remember when forgotten. The dream would become that anchor. But at 17, it simply created conflict. Why God allows visible favor. This is uncomfortable, but important. God does not always hide the calling. Sometimes he lets it be seen. Sometimes he allows the coat to be obvious. Why? Because exposure reveals hearts, both yours and theirs. Joseph's favor exposed jealousy in his brothers. It exposed immaturity in himself. It exposed division already present in the family. Favor doesn't create hatred. It uncovers it. If love is uneven in a system, favor becomes a mirror. And Joseph's life became the mirror. The psychological pressure. Imagine being Joseph. You feel chosen. You feel seen. You feel called. But you also feel the stares. The silence when you enter a room. The short responses. The forced cooperation in the fields. You sense the distance growing. You can't shrink the coat. You can't erase the dream. You can't undo your father's preference. So you keep walking. There's a quiet courage in that. Because some people try to dim themselves to maintain peace. Joseph didn't. Not out of rebellion, but out of identity. He didn't apologize for what he had been given. That's important. Calling isn't arrogance. Favor isn't guilt. Assignment isn't ego. But it will cost you comfort. The sibling storm brewing. The brothers' resentment wasn't only about the coat. It was about legacy. Reuben was firstborn. Judah was strong and persuasive. Each had his own expectation of inheritance and authority. Then comes Joseph, younger, wrapped in symbolism, speaking of rulership. It destabilized the hierarchy. When God raises someone unexpectedly, those who assumed succession often feel threatened. It wasn't just jealousy. It was fear of displacement. And fear turns quickly to hostility. The more Joseph spoke of dreams, the more his brothers rehearsed their anger. Bitterness grows in repetition. They replayed his words. They replayed the bowing imagery. They replayed the sight of that robe. Every rehearsal deepened the resentment. Jacob's complicated love. Jacob loved Joseph, but he may not have understood the consequences of how he showed it. Parents shape environments. Leaders shape cultures. Favoritism fractures. Jacob's own life had been marked by favoritism. He had been favored by his mother Rebekah over Esau. He knew firsthand the division it caused. Yet patterns often repeat when not healed. The coat was love, but it was also a trigger. And Joseph stood at the center of generational complexity. The call that offends before it inspires. Notice this. Joseph's dream did not inspire anyone at first. It offended them. That's often how God's assignments work. Before your calling becomes someone's blessing, it might become someone's irritation. Before your leadership brings stability, it might provoke instability. Before the palace, there is pushback. Joseph's dream was divine, but it clashed with human expectations. He didn't yet know how costly that clash would be. The silent shift. After the dreams, something changed. The text says his brothers could not speak a kind word to him. Silence is often the first warning sign of fracture. Conversations shortened. Laughter faded. Distance widened. Joseph likely felt it, but he may not have grasped how deep it ran. Favor isolates slowly. It doesn't explode immediately. It simmers. And the simmer was nearing its boil. The preparation hidden inside preference. Here's the deeper truth. The coat wasn't just favoritism. It was training. Joseph was learning how to stand alone. He was learning how to carry distinction without collapsing under criticism. He was learning how to endure misunderstanding without abandoning identity. Because leadership requires all three. God wasn't just giving him a coat. He was preparing him for isolation. You cannot govern nations if you crumble under sibling tension. The favor was the first test. Would Joseph shrink? Would he compromise? Would he deny the dream to restore comfort? He didn't. And that mattered. The setup before the storm. By the time Joseph went looking for his brothers in the fields that fateful day, the emotional groundwork had already been laid. The coat had marked him. The dreams had angered them. The favoritism had divided them. The pit didn't begin in the wilderness. It began at home. But understand this clearly. The coat was not the mistake. The dream was not the error. The calling was not premature in God's plan. It was perfectly timed for heaven, even if it felt disruptive on earth. Joseph was not wrong for being favored. He was chosen. And sometimes, being chosen is the beginning of being challenged. The coat would soon be torn from his shoulders. The dream would seem buried in sand. But neither would disappear. Because what God wraps around you externally is temporary. What he plants inside you is permanent. Joseph wore the coat, but he carried the calling. And that calling was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The pit did not surprise heaven. It shocked Joseph, but it did not shock God. Because betrayal is never random in a calling this large. It feels sudden. It feels violent. It feels unfair. But it is rarely accidental. The walk toward the breaking point. Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers. That detail matters. Joseph did not wander into danger on his own. He was sent by his father. There's something deeply painful about that. He obeyed. He went looking for them near Shechem, then further to Dothan. He searched. He asked strangers for directions. He kept going until he found them. He wasn't avoiding them. He wasn't hiding from tension. He walked toward the very men who resented him. From a distance, they saw him coming. And Scripture says something chilling. They plotted to kill him before he reached them. Before he spoke. Before he greeted them. Before he did anything wrong that day. The hatred had matured. It didn't need a new offense. It was ready. The dreamer is coming. They didn't call him brother. They called him the dreamer. Notice that. When people reduce you to your calling in a tone of mockery, they are no longer relating to you. They are reacting to what you represent. Here comes the dreamer. There's sarcasm in that sentence. There's resentment. There's challenge. They weren't just angry at Joseph. They were angry at the future he symbolized. Dreams confront insecurity. Joseph's dreams had announced a hierarchy shift, and they didn't like the sound of it. So they decided to erase the possibility. If we kill him, they said, we'll see what becomes of his dreams. That's the psychology of opposition. Destroy the vessel, cancel the vision. The first stripping. When Joseph reached them, they didn't argue first. They grabbed him. They stripped him of his robe. Pause there. Before they threw him into the pit, they removed the coat. The symbol of favor. The evidence of distinction. The visible sign of calling. They tore it off. Because envy doesn't just want to hurt you. It wants to remove what makes you different. That robe represented everything they resented. And ripping it off was symbolic violence. They wanted him ordinary. They wanted him unmarked. They wanted him equalized. But calling cannot be stripped by hands. Clothing can be removed. Assignment cannot. Still, imagine Joseph in that moment. Confused. Overpowered. Outnumbered. The brothers he grew up with now physically assaulting him. No warning. No negotiation. Just force. The pit. They threw him into a cistern, a dry well carved into the earth. No water. Just depth. Just isolation. Just echo. The pit is a brutal place because it's both confinement and exposure. You can't move forward. You can't climb out. And you can hear life happening above you. Scripture doesn't record Joseph's exact words, but later, when the brothers reflect on this moment, they say something revealing. We saw his distress when he pleaded with us. He begged. Let that sit for a second. Joseph, the favored son. Joseph, the dreamer. Joseph, the one with the coat. Now pleading. Tears mixing with dust. Voice cracking in desperation. Please. But they ignored him. Sometimes betrayal is loud. Sometimes it's cold. This one was cold. Because after throwing him into the pit, they sat down to eat. They ate. Above his cries. Above his confusion. Above his heartbreak. That detail is almost unbearable. The people who once shared meals with him now shared a meal while he suffered. That's how hardened resentment can become. Reuben's hesitation. Reuben, the oldest, wasn't fully aligned with the murder plan. He suggested throwing Joseph into the pit instead, secretly intending to rescue him later. Reuben represents partial courage. He didn't fully confront the brothers. He didn't openly defend Joseph. He chose a middle ground. And middle ground in moments of injustice often leads to tragedy. Reuben left briefly, and while he was gone, the plan shifted. Because when opposition is determined, hesitation creates opportunity. The caravan. As they sat eating, they saw traders approaching, Ishmaelites on their way to Egypt. Judah had an idea. Why kill him? Let's sell him. Murder felt too permanent. Profit felt practical. So they pulled Joseph out of the pit, not to rescue him, but to monetize him. 20 pieces of silver. That was the price. Think about that. The son of Jacob, the carrier of a generational promise. Sold like inventory. From favored son to transaction. Joseph likely thought the worst was over when they lifted him from the pit. He probably thought rescue had arrived. Instead, chains. Instead, strangers. Instead, exile. The pit wasn't the final blow. It was the prelude. Betrayal by blood. Being hurt by strangers is painful. Being betrayed by family is devastating. Joseph didn't just lose freedom. He lost belonging. He lost familiarity. He lost the security of shared history. The men who sold him knew his childhood stories. They knew his laugh. They knew his fears. And they handed him over anyway. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those who know you well, because they know where to wound. The psychology of the brothers. Why didn't they stop? Because resentment justifies cruelty over time. When anger is rehearsed long enough, empathy erodes. They had replayed Joseph's dreams so often that they no longer saw him as a brother. They saw him as a threat. And once someone becomes a threat in your mind, extreme actions feel logical. This wasn't a spontaneous explosion. It was accumulated bitterness. The pit was premeditated. The bloodied coat. After selling him, they dipped the coat in goat's blood. They sent it back to Jacob. Recognize this? That sentence is haunting. It mirrors something from Jacob's own past, when he deceived his father with Esau's garment and goat's skin. Now the pattern returns. Deception cycles through generations when not confronted. Jacob believed Joseph was dead, and Joseph was gone. As far as the family knew, the dream was buried, the threat removed, the future neutralized. But heaven had not changed its plan. The spiritual reality. Here's what makes this moment powerful. God did not stop it. He could have. He could have sent intervention. He could have exposed the plot. He could have softened hearts. But he didn't. Why? Because the pit was not outside the plan. It was part of the pathway. Joseph needed Egypt. Egypt required separation. Separation required betrayal. We often pray for purpose, but resist the processes that escort us there. Joseph's destiny was tied to a nation, but he first had to be disconnected from comfort. The pit was the exit door, the sound of silence from heaven. Imagine Joseph that first night with the caravan. Bound, moving away from home. No explanation from God. No audible reassurance. Just silence. Dreams feel foolish in chains. Calling feels distant when freedom is gone. This is where many people quit internally. They reinterpret the dream as imagination. They rewrite the narrative as mistake. Joseph had every reason to doubt, but Scripture shows no record of him renouncing his identity. Silence from heaven does not mean absence of direction. Sometimes God is quiet because the process is working. The pit as separation. The pit did more than wound Joseph. It separated him. It removed him from sibling rivalry. It detached him from favoritism. It pulled him out of generational dysfunction. Painful separation often precedes strategic placement. Joseph could not rule Egypt while emotionally entangled in family tension. The pit was brutal, but it was clarifying. It marked the end of one season, not the end of his story. The illusion of victory. His brothers believed they had won. They believed they had silenced the dream. But you cannot kill what God has authored. You can delay it. You can complicate it. You can redirect it. But you cannot cancel it. Joseph's story did not collapse in the pit. It deepened. Because destiny tested becomes destiny refined. When the pit becomes your teacher, the pit teaches what the palace cannot. It teaches endurance. It teaches surrender. It teaches humility. Joseph entered the pit as the favored son. He left it as something stronger. Not yet a leader. Not yet a governor. But no longer naive. Betrayal matures you quickly. It strips illusion. It exposes fragility. It forces reliance. The code is gone now. The visible favor removed. But the internal calling remains. And sometimes God removes the external symbols so he can strengthen the internal substance. The deeper truth. The pit wasn't random. It wasn't divine neglect. It wasn't proof that the dream was false. It was the doorway into a larger arena. Joseph's life could have stayed small and safe in Canaan. Instead, it would influence empires. But empires require endurance. And endurance is born in betrayal. Joseph did not know it yet. But the pit was not his grave. It was his gateway. And what looked like the death of his dream was actually the transportation of it. The betrayal hurt. The chains were real. The separation was devastating. But the dream was still alive. Because when God authors a future, even a pit becomes part of the architecture. The caravan didn't stop. It moved. Slowly at first, then steadily, southward, away from the only life Joseph had ever known. Every step of the camels felt like a sentence being written without his permission. Canaan faded behind him. Dust replaced familiarity. Voices shifted from Hebrew accents to foreign tones. Joseph was 17. Yesterday he was a son. Today he was property. That transition is violent, not just physically, but psychologically. Because slavery doesn't just change your location. It attempts to redefine your identity. The sound of chains. We don't often imagine the sensory details. The rope around his wrists. The dryness in his throat from crying and dust. The rhythm of hooves on hard earth. He had time to think. Time to replay the moment in the field. Time to remember his father's face. Time to question the dream. Did I misunderstand it? Was it ego? Was it imagination? Dreams sound bold at home. They sound ridiculous in captivity. Joseph had no control over where he was going. No vote. No leverage. He had been priced and purchased. 20 pieces of silver. That number echoes in history, because betrayal often has a market value. To his brothers, he was worth money. To God, he was worth a nation. The geography of transition. Egypt wasn't just another place. It was a superpower. Structured, organized, hierarchical. Where Canaan was pastoral and tribal, Egypt was administrative and imperial. Joseph wasn't being taken to obscurity. He was being taken to infrastructure. But he didn't know that yet. All he knew was loss. Loss of language familiarity. Loss of cultural belonging. Loss of his father's covering. Even the memory of the coat must have stung. The garment that once marked him now replaced by rough slave clothing. The external symbols reversed. Favor had become humiliation. Identity under assault. Slavery attempts to collapse identity into function. You are not a person. You are utility. You are not a son. You are labor. And for someone who carried a dream of leadership, this was disorienting. The enemy of destiny often attacks identity first. If Joseph could be convinced he was only a slave, the dream would wither internally long before it manifested externally. Because destiny begins in belief before it appears in circumstance. This season was about internal negotiation. Would he let chains rename him? Or would he remember who he was? The auction of potential. When they reached Egypt, Joseph was sold again. Another transaction. Another evaluation. This time to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. Let's pause there. He wasn't sold to a random farmer. He wasn't assigned to a forgotten village. He was purchased into a high-ranking household within Pharaoh's administration. This wasn't coincidence. It was positioning disguised as demotion. But Joseph couldn't see the strategy yet. All he saw was a foreign master. All he felt was displacement. All he carried was a silent dream. The emotional collapse that didn't happen. Here's something remarkable. Scripture does not describe Joseph spiraling. It does not describe him rebelling. It does not describe him hardening. It simply says, the Lord was with Joseph. That statement is quiet but powerful. Because presence does not prevent pain. It sustains through it. Joseph's circumstances screamed abandonment. But heaven's reality was companionship. He had lost family, but not favor. Lost freedom, but not calling. Lost comfort, but not purpose. And this is where many destinies are either strengthened or suffocated. When the environment changes violently, identity must stabilize internally. Joseph didn't deny his situation. He served. That decision changed everything. From victim to steward. Joseph could have adopted a victim mindset. I was betrayed. I was cheated. I don't belong here. All true. But he chose responsibility over resentment. He worked. He learned the language. He observed Egyptian systems. He understood hierarchy. He adapted without surrendering identity. That balance is rare. Many people either assimilate fully and forget who they are, or resist so strongly that they sabotage opportunity. Joseph did neither. He stayed distinct internally, while becoming excellent externally. That is leadership training. The economics of excellence. The text says everything Joseph touched prospered. That's not mystical exaggeration. That's competence. Excellence is often the first visible sign of divine favor. Joseph didn't wait for the palace to practice leadership. He led as a slave. He organized. He managed. He improved systems. Potiphar noticed. Because true leadership is not position-dependent. It is posture-dependent. Joseph had no title, but he had discipline. And discipline makes favor undeniable. The reframing of loss. Something powerful happens in this stage. Joseph stops asking, "Why did this happen?" and starts asking, "How can I grow here?" That shift is everything. Because pain without purpose breeds bitterness. But pain with possibility breeds resilience. Egypt was not home, but it became training ground. Slavery was not destiny, but it became development. God rarely wastes transitions. The sale was violent, but it was directional. Joseph's family thought they were eliminating his future. They were accelerating it. The humbling of ego. Let's be honest. 17-year-old Joseph may have carried traces of immaturity. The dreams were bold. The reporting on his brothers may have been rigid. The pit crushed naivety. The sale dismantled entitlement. Now, stripped of comfort and status, Joseph had to build character without applause. That's refining fire. He was no longer the favored son in a tent. He was a servant in a palace-adjacent household. And this time, no one celebrated him for existing. He had to earn trust. That process built depth. The invisible strategy. Think about the geography again. Canaan had promise. Egypt had power. Joseph's dream involved governance. Governance requires systems. Egypt was the global leader in administration, storage systems, food distribution, tax structures, security protocols. Joseph was about to learn how an empire functions from the inside. But first, he had to learn how to serve within it. Service precedes authority. Always. The internal question. In quiet moments, perhaps at night, Joseph must have wrestled internally. Do I still believe the dream? Or do I reinterpret it as youthful imagination? Because here's the tension. The dream said leadership. Reality said slavery. When promise and present clash, faith is tested. Not loud faith. Quiet faith. The kind that keeps showing up. Keeps working. Keeps choosing integrity. Joseph didn't have an audience. He didn't have encouragement from family. He had memory. Memory of what God showed him. And sometimes memory is enough to survive a season. The redefinition of status. Joseph's social status plummeted, but his spiritual status did not. That distinction matters. Circumstances can downgrade your title. They cannot downgrade your calling. You can be misidentified by society and still be accurately known by heaven. Joseph was labeled slave. God still saw governor. That's the tension of hidden seasons. The discipline of obscurity. Obscurity is not punishment. It's preparation. In Canaan, Joseph was visible and controversial. In Egypt, he was invisible and consistent. He learned to function without validation. He learned to excel without recognition from those who knew his story. This is maturity. When your motivation shifts from proving others wrong to becoming who God designed you to be. Joseph didn't serve to impress his brothers anymore. They were gone. He served because excellence aligned with identity. The sale as relocation, not rejection. It's tempting to view the sale as pure rejection. And emotionally, it was. But strategically, it was relocation. Joseph couldn't reach the palace from Canaan. He needed proximity. And proximity required displacement. Sometimes what feels like abandonment is actually positioning. But positioning hurts. Because it disrupts familiarity. It demands adaptation. It forces growth at uncomfortable speed. The paradox of progress. From the outside, Joseph's life was declining. From the inside, it was strengthening. The sale reduced his freedom, but it increased his exposure to complexity. It reduced his comfort, but it increased his competence. It reduced his status, but it increased his capacity. Capacity is what destiny requires. Not dreams alone, not favor alone. Capacity. And capacity is built under pressure. The son still within the slave. Though sold, Joseph did not lose sonship internally. That's the miracle. He was physically owned, but spiritually free. Because identity rooted in God cannot be auctioned. Chains can restrict movement. They cannot restrain purpose. And this season proved something crucial. Joseph's calling was not dependent on environment. It traveled with him. The sale was humiliating. It was unjust. It was traumatic. But it was not accidental. It was directional. Joseph thought he was losing everything. In reality, he was being escorted toward the stage where his dream would one day unfold, not as a boast, but as salvation. From son to slave. From robe to rope. From family tent to Egyptian estate. The trajectory looked downward, but heaven's design was upward. Because sometimes, the fastest route to the palace begins with a price tag. If the pit was violent, and the sale was humiliating, Potiphar's house was quiet. No dramatic betrayal. No public trauma. No visible injustice. Just routine. And routine can be more dangerous than crisis. Because crisis sharpens you, but routine tests you. Joseph had arrived in Egypt as property, but in Potiphar's house, he began to rise again. Not suddenly, not spectacularly, but steadily. And steady growth in obscurity is one of the hardest disciplines in destiny. The discipline of starting over. Joseph had to rebuild everything. New language, new customs, new expectations. He wasn't the favored son anymore. No one knew his story. No one cared about his dreams. He had no reputation to rely on. So he built one. That's the first lesson of hidden seasons. You don't lean on what you were. You build who you're becoming. Joseph could have minimized effort. I don't belong here. This isn't my calling. This is beneath me. But destiny doesn't skip training because it feels small. He worked. He observed. He learned how Egyptian households functioned. He noticed systems, storage, finances, security, logistics. He didn't just survive. He studied. Because hidden seasons are classrooms. The Lord was with Joseph. That phrase repeats in Scripture like a quiet drumbeat. The Lord was with Joseph. Not when he became governor. Not when he stood before Pharaoh. Here, as a slave, presence does not mean applause. It means alignment. God was not absent in Potiphar's house. He was building something. And the evidence showed. Everything Joseph touched prospered. That wasn't magic. It was stewardship. He treated someone else's house like his own responsibility. That's integrity. Leadership is revealed in how you handle what isn't yours yet. Promotion without platform. Potiphar noticed. Excellence is difficult to ignore. Joseph was gradually given responsibility. First small tasks, then oversight of other servants, then management of resources. Eventually, Potiphar entrusted him with everything. Everything. A slave managing an elite Egyptian household. That's extraordinary. But here's the paradox. Joseph was rising, yet still unseen by the world that mattered. No family applause. No recognition from Canaan. No validation from those who doubted him. Hidden growth. And hidden growth tests motives. Are you becoming excellent for applause? Or because excellence reflects who you are? Joseph chose the second. The healing of ego. In Canaan, Joseph had a coat. In Egypt, he had responsibility. The coat was symbolic. Responsibility was substance. Hidden seasons heal ego. Because ego feeds on visibility. Joseph's early dreams may have carried youthful intensity. Now, maturity was replacing impulse. He learned how authority feels from below. He learned how systems operate from the inside. He learned patience. And patience is rarely formed in spotlight. The architecture of character. Potiphar's house became Joseph's forge. Character was being constructed. Humility without insecurity. Confidence without arrogance. Competence without pride. When you manage what belongs to someone else faithfully, you learn accountability. Joseph couldn't afford laziness. He couldn't afford emotional volatility. He had to become disciplined. Because in Egypt, structure mattered. Schedules mattered. Order mattered. Hierarchy mattered. This was preparation for governance. But Joseph didn't know the full picture. He just showed up daily. Hidden seasons often feel repetitive, but repetition builds mastery. Isolation without bitterness. Here's something profound. Joseph was alone, but he didn't grow bitter. Bitterness would have been understandable. Betrayed by brothers. Sold into slavery. Stripped of family. But there's no record of him complaining to Potiphar. No evidence of rebellion. No sabotage. That restraint reveals strength. Because unresolved pain can leak into performance. Joseph didn't let his wounds define his work. He didn't weaponize his suffering. He separated trauma from identity. That is emotional maturity. Excellence as warfare. Every day Joseph chose excellence. He was defying the narrative of his betrayal. You tried to reduce me, but I will grow. That's quiet warfare. Not loud revenge. Not dramatic confrontation. Just consistency. Consistency is powerful. It compounds. Over time, Potiphar trusted him so deeply that he concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. Think about that level of delegation. Joseph, once stripped of a robe, now overseeing wealth and influence. Hidden seasons may not look impressive, but they accumulate credibility. The internal wrestling. Still, there must have been nights of reflection. Nights when Joseph remembered his father. Nights when he replayed the pit. Nights when he wondered if the dream was still alive. Growth doesn't eliminate questions. It simply teaches you to function while holding them. Joseph learned how to carry unanswered prayers without losing discipline. That's rare, because many people allow uncertainty to justify disengagement. He didn't. He kept serving. The tension of success in captivity. Joseph was thriving, but still enslaved. That tension is complicated. He was respected, but not free. Promoted, but still owned. Success inside limitation can feel confusing. But sometimes God lets you experience growth before freedom to prove that your environment does not control your potential. Joseph's capacity was expanding. His administrative skills sharpened. His leadership instincts refined. He was no longer the teenager who spoke dreams impulsively. He was becoming a man of weight. Why the hidden season matters. Imagine if Joseph had skipped this. If he had gone directly from pit to palace. He would have had dreams, but no discipline. Vision, but no systems knowledge. Authority, but no tested character. Potiphar's house was essential. It gave him experience managing wealth, exposure to Egyptian culture, understanding of hierarchy, practice in leadership, maturity under pressure. It wasn't glamorous, but it was foundational. Foundations are rarely celebrated, yet everything rests on them. The subtle rebuilding of confidence. After betrayal, trust fractures. Joseph's trust in people was likely shaken, but in Potiphar's house, something rebuilt. He saw that not everyone was against him. Potiphar trusted him, delegated to him, relied on him. That restored a sense of relational stability. Healing doesn't always come through dramatic encounters. Sometimes it comes through consistent responsibility. Joseph began to see that his life was not over. Different, yes. Delayed, maybe, but not destroyed. The preparation for temptation. And then comes the next layer. Scripture notes something almost casually. Joseph was well-built and handsome. That detail matters. Because favor in work is one test. Favor in appearance is another. Potiphar's wife noticed. Opportunity often introduces temptation. When you're rising quietly, distractions increase. This wasn't random. This was the next refinement. Because leadership without integrity collapses. And Joseph's integrity was about to be tested in private. But before that test, this hidden season shaped him. He had already learned discipline. Already learned self-control. Already learned excellence without applause. Those muscles would matter soon. The hidden season as strength builder. Invisibility builds internal muscle. When no one is watching, your choices reveal your core. Joseph's consistency in Potiphar's house proved something. He wasn't excellent because he was favored. He was excellent because it was who he chose to be. That distinction defines longevity. Favor can open doors. Character keeps them open. And Potiphar's house was the training ground for both. The quiet faithfulness that changes trajectories. Joseph didn't know when his story would shift again. He didn't know prison was coming. He didn't know palace was coming either. He only knew the present task. And he mastered it. Hidden seasons feel small, but they determine future scale. If Joseph had grown bitter, lazy, or reckless here, the next door would have closed. But because he remained faithful in obscurity, he was being positioned for something larger. God does not waste silent seasons. He uses them to prepare public impact. The invisible hand. While Joseph managed Potiphar's house, heaven was managing timelines. Famines would come. Nations would need strategy. Pharaoh would need a dream interpreted. But before that, Joseph needed formation. And formation happens where no one claps. In kitchens. In corridors. In daily repetition. Potiphar's house was not glamorous. But it was sacred. Because it was where a slave learned how to govern. The pit tested his survival. The sale tested his identity. Potiphar's house tested his consistency. And consistency builds capacity. Joseph was no longer just a dreamer. He was becoming a leader. Not loudly. Not visibly. But undeniably. And soon, his integrity would be tested in a way that would cost him everything he had rebuilt. Because hidden seasons do not end quietly. They transition through fire. And Joseph was about to face his next trial. Growth attracts attention. Joseph had been rising quietly in Potiphar's house. Competent, trusted, disciplined. But excellence does not go unnoticed. And neither does character. The text says Potiphar's wife took notice of Joseph. That phrase is calm on the surface, but underneath it, a storm was forming. Because temptation rarely announces itself dramatically at first. It begins with attention, the subtle shift. Joseph had gone from invisible to influential within the household. He oversaw resources. He managed servants. He carried authority under Potiphar's name. And he was young, handsome, competent. Those traits can open doors and create vulnerabilities. Potiphar's wife began making advances. Come to bed with me. Direct. Repeated. Persistent. This wasn't a one-time proposition. It was daily pressure. Integrity is rarely tested once. It is tested repeatedly. The loneliness factor. Consider Joseph's situation. He was far from home, separated from family, no spouse, no close companions from his past. Isolation amplifies temptation. When you feel unseen emotionally, attention can feel intoxicating. When you've been betrayed, validation can feel healing. Potiphar's wife wasn't just offering pleasure. She was offering affirmation. You matter. I see you. I want you. Those words can be powerful, especially in loneliness. But Joseph recognized something deeper. This wasn't love. It was compromise disguised as opportunity. The internal battle. Temptation is not about weakness alone. It is about identity conflict. Joseph had to decide, am I a victim entitled to indulgence? Or am I a steward accountable to God? No one from Canaan was watching. His brothers were gone. His father believed him dead. He could have rationalized. I've suffered enough. I deserve something. No one will know. Integrity is tested most intensely when secrecy is guaranteed. Joseph chose clarity over comfort. The refusal. He said no. Not vaguely. Not passively. He explained why. My master trusts me with everything. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Notice the layers in that statement. First, loyalty to Potiphar. Second, accountability to God. Even in Egypt, even as a slave, Joseph still defined himself as accountable to a higher authority. Environment had changed. Conviction had not. That's the power of rooted identity. The cost of consistency. She persisted. Day after day. This wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was sustained pressure. Temptation wears down resolve through repetition. But Joseph avoided her. Avoidance is often underrated wisdom. He didn't linger in risky proximity. He created boundaries. Integrity is not just about saying no. It's about structuring your life so the no is sustainable. Still, pressure builds. And pressure looks for opportunity. The setup. One day the house was empty. No other servants inside. Joseph went in to do his work. Routine. Normal. But she was waiting. She grabbed his garment. Come to bed with me. This time, it escalated physically. The moment narrowed. No witnesses. No accountability structures. No escape except one. Joseph ran. He left his cloak in her hand. He fled. And sometimes, the most powerful act of leadership is retreat. He chose reputation with God over reputation with man. But integrity often leaves evidence behind. The garment became accusation. False accusation. Rejection wounded her pride. And wounded pride seeks revenge. She screamed. She called servants. She constructed a narrative. He came to me. She held up the cloak as proof. Evidence without context can be manipulated. Potiphar returned. He heard the story. Joseph had no courtroom, no defense, no advocate. The man who trusted him now heard a charge that attacked the very integrity he had built. And here's the painful truth. Integrity does not guarantee protection from false accusation. Sometimes it provokes it. The collapse of reputation. In a moment, everything Joseph rebuilt collapsed. Trust dissolved. Authority removed. Position stripped. From overseer to prisoner. Again, he had done the right thing. And it cost him. That's the hardest part. If sin had caused the fall, it would make sense. But obedience caused this fall. Faithfulness led to prison. That can shake a person. Because we expect righteousness to produce immediate reward. But sometimes it produces isolation. The emotional earthquake. Imagine Joseph's thoughts. I resisted. I honored God. I protected my master's trust. And this is the outcome? Back in confinement. Back in chains. Back in a place that feels like the pit all over again. This is where bitterness could have entered. This is pointless. Integrity doesn't work. God didn't defend me. But the text again says something quiet and profound. The Lord was with Joseph. Not preventing prison. Present in prison. Why God allows integrity to cost. If integrity always led to instant reward, it wouldn't be integrity. It would be strategy. Joseph's choice was pure. No audience. No applause. No guarantee of benefit. Just alignment with conviction. That kind of integrity strengthens internal structure. It solidifies character so deeply that external chaos cannot shatter it. God was building a leader who would one day hold immense power. And power without tested integrity destroys nations. Joseph's refusal wasn't just about morality. It was about future capacity. The cloak pattern. Notice the pattern. First, his brothers stripped his coat. Now, he leaves another garment behind. Clothing keeps being taken. Symbols of identity removed. But identity itself remains intact. External coverings fall away. Internal conviction strengthens. Joseph is losing layers of visible status, but gaining layers of invisible strength. The paradox of descent. Joseph keeps descending. From favored son, to slave, to trusted servant, to prisoner. Each stage feels like regression. But spiritually, it's progression. Because depth is forming. You cannot carry authority in the palace if accusation in the house breaks you. Joseph's soul was being reinforced. His ego already dismantled. Now his endurance expanded. The silence again. No angel intervened. No immediate vindication. No dramatic clearing of his name. Just prison. Sometimes heaven is silent not because it is absent, but because the test is passing. Joseph passed. He didn't compromise. He didn't negotiate with temptation. He didn't trade destiny for comfort. That matters more than immediate freedom. The real victory. Most people define victory as escape. Joseph defined victory as obedience. Even though it cost him position. Even though it cost him comfort. Even though it cost him reputation. Because integrity is not about outcome. It's about alignment. And alignment anchors destiny. Prison again, but different. This prison wasn't a random dungeon. It was the prison where Pharaoh's officials were held. Again, strategic placement disguised as punishment. Joseph didn't know that yet. He just knew he had fallen again. But he hadn't fallen spiritually. He had risen internally. His character was now battle-tested. Temptation resisted. Accusation endured. Position lost without rebellion. That combination creates uncommon leaders. When doing right feels like losing, this is the moment many people quit. They obey and suffer. They stand firm and lose. And they conclude, what's the point? But Joseph didn't measure faithfulness by reward. He measured it by consistency. Even in prison, he would soon begin rising again. Not because life was fair, but because character compounds. The foundation of future authority. One day, Joseph would hold power over grain during famine. He would have access to wealth, influence, and political leverage. If he had compromised privately here, that power would corrupt him later. This test was protective. It filtered out weakness. It sealed his integrity. It proved that even in isolation, he chose righteousness. That is leadership gold. The test cost him position. It cost him freedom. It cost him reputation. But it secured something far greater. Unshakable integrity. Joseph entered Potiphar's house as a promising servant. He left it as a tested man. And prison, once again, became the next classroom. Because destiny does not advance through comfort. It advances through refinement. And Joseph was being refined into someone who could carry a crown without losing his soul. If the pit was betrayal, and Potiphar's house was testing, the prison was silence. Not loud injustice. Not dramatic temptation. Just waiting. And waiting can erode the strongest resolve. Joseph entered prison wrongly accused. Again stripped of reputation. Again displaced. Again misunderstood. But this time, something was different. He wasn't the same 17-year-old dreamer. He was seasoned. Still wounded, yes. Still human, yes. But no longer naive. The second descent. Prison has a psychological weight. It tells you, this is where stories end. Dark walls. Limited movement. Restricted autonomy. Joseph had done nothing wrong. And yet here he was. Again, there's something uniquely painful about recurring injustice. The first betrayal shocks you. The second makes you question the pattern. Why does this keep happening? That question can fracture faith. But Joseph did not fracture. The Lord was with him, again. Scripture repeats the line. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness. Not outside the prison. Inside it. Divine presence is not location dependent. It is relationship dependent. Joseph had lost freedom, but not favor. Lost status, but not calling. And the prison warden noticed something. The same pattern from Potiphar's house repeated. Joseph earned trust. Again, he was given responsibility. Again. How? Because character travels with you. Even when your environment changes. Excellence in confinement. Joseph began managing prisoners. Think about that. A prisoner overseeing prisoners. That's influence and limitation. He didn't wait for release to lead. He led inside confinement. That is rare. Many people postpone excellence. I'll try when I'm free. I'll care when I'm promoted. I'll grow when things are fair. Joseph chose growth anyway. Prison became another classroom. The emotional quiet. But let's not romanticize it. Prison is lonely. Long nights. Unanswered questions. No timeline. Days blur together. No one from Canaan knew where he was. His father believed him dead. His brothers moved on with their lives. Potiphar likely never reconsidered. And heaven was quiet. No new dreams. No new promises. No audible reassurance. Just repetition. Repetition tests faith more deeply than crisis. Because crisis has adrenaline. Waiting has erosion. The cupbearer and the baker. Then something shifted. Two high-ranking officials from Pharaoh's court were imprisoned, the cupbearer and the baker. Political fallout. Internal scandal. They entered Joseph's world. And one night, they both had dreams. Disturbing dreams. Joseph noticed their distress. Pause there. He was in prison. He had his own unresolved injustice. Yet he still paid attention to someone else's pain. That is maturity. Suffering had not made him self-absorbed. It had made him observant. Do not interpretations belong to God, he said. Tell me your dreams. Notice his language. He still referenced God. Even in prison. Even in silence. His theology hadn't collapsed. Interpreting in the dark. Joseph interpreted their dreams accurately. The cupbearer would be restored. The baker would be executed. Bold clarity. No hesitation. No fear of being wrong. The gift still worked. That's powerful. Because many people bury their gifts when they feel forgotten. Joseph did not. He exercised his calling in confinement. That matters. The request. After interpreting, Joseph made a simple request to the cupbearer. When you are restored, remember me. That line is deeply human. He wasn't super spiritual. He wasn't detached. He wanted release. He wanted justice. He wanted to be remembered. And that's reasonable. The cupbearer was restored. Just as Joseph said. He stood again in Pharaoh's court. Back in influence. Back in power. Back in proximity to decision-making. Joseph's hope must have ignited. This is it. This is the moment. This is how I get out. But Scripture adds one devastating sentence. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Forgot. That word is heavy. Not betrayed violently. Just forgotten quietly. The pain of being overlooked. Being forgotten can hurt more than being opposed. At least enemies acknowledge your existence. Forgetfulness erases you. Joseph had helped him. Accurately. Selflessly. And now, silence. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. Then years. 2 full years. No mention. No rescue. No recognition. That's the real test. Not temptation. Not accusation. Delay. When the gift doesn't open the door. Joseph's interpretation was flawless. But it didn't free him. That can be confusing. You use your gift. You help others. You stay faithful. And nothing changes. This is where many people grow cynical. What's the point? Joseph could have shut down. He could have stopped caring. Stopped interpreting. Stopped believing. But there is no record of bitterness. Silence was forming endurance. The expansion of capacity. Those 2 years weren't wasted. Time in obscurity expands capacity quietly. Joseph was growing emotionally. Growing spiritually. Growing mentally. He was learning how to endure without timeline. Learning how to trust without visible progress. Learning how to function without validation. That depth cannot be rushed. The slow death of entitlement. By now, any remaining entitlement was gone. No more expectation of quick elevation. No more assumption of immediate fulfillment. Just consistency. That shift is critical. Because leadership without entitlement is stable. Joseph was no longer dreaming impulsively. He was steady, rooted, solid. The psychology of waiting. Waiting forces you to confront yourself. No distractions. No applause. No urgency. Just you and your thoughts. Joseph had to reconcile something. Was the dream still true? Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just internally. And apparently, he decided yes. Because he kept showing up. Kept managing. Kept trusting. Even when forgotten. Heaven's timing. While Joseph waited, something else was happening. Pharaoh would soon dream. A dream no one could interpret. A dream that would destabilize the empire. But Pharaoh's dream didn't come when Joseph first entered prison. It came after 2 years. Why? Because timing matters. Joseph needed to be fully formed. Egypt needed to be fully desperate. And the cupbearer needed to finally remember. Delay is not denial. It is alignment. The maturity of silence. Silence can either break you or deepen you. Joseph let it deepen him. No record of rage. No evidence of revenge fantasies. No spiritual collapse. Just endurance. The prison didn't define him. It refined him. Forgotten by man, not by God. The cupbearer forgot, but heaven did not. God had not misplaced Joseph's file, had not lost track of his promise, had not reconsidered the dream. Silence does not equal absence. It often equals preparation. The wait before the shift. By the time Pharaoh would dream, Joseph was ready. Not just gifted. Ready. Ready emotionally. Ready spiritually. Ready strategically. If Pharaoh had called for Joseph 2 years earlier, he might not have carried the same gravity. But now, he had depth. He had scars. He had endurance. The silence had done its work. Joseph entered prison unjustly. He remained there forgotten. But in the quiet, something unshakable was forming. A man who could endure betrayal without hatred, temptation without compromise, delay without despair. And when the door finally opened, it would open suddenly. Because destiny often shifts without warning. But only after silence has completed its formation. The world had forgotten Joseph. But heaven had not. And soon, the silence would break. It happened in a day. After years of betrayal. After slavery. After false accusation. After 2 full years of silence. In one day, everything changed. Destiny often moves like that. Slow, slow, slow. Then suddenly, Pharaoh dreams. Pharaoh, the most powerful man in Egypt, dreamed. Not once. Twice. 7 healthy cows swallowed by 7 thin cows. 7 full heads of grain devoured by 7 scorched ones. Disturbing. Unsettling. Persistent. He called for magicians. Wise men. Advisors. No one could interpret it. And suddenly, memory returned. The cupbearer spoke. I remember my faults today. That sentence is loaded. 2 years late. But perfectly timed. He told Pharaoh about the Hebrew prisoner who interpreted dreams accurately. Joseph's name resurfaced. Not because Joseph campaigned. Not because he manipulated. Because timing aligned. The call. Pharaoh sent for him. Quickly. The text says they hurried him out of the dungeon. Pause there. No warning. No gradual transition. No preparation window. One moment, prisoner. Next moment, summoned to the throne room. Destiny doesn't always announce itself in advance. Sometimes it interrupts routine. Joseph shaved. Changed clothes. Presentation matters. You can carry deep character, but you must also be ready when the door opens. Hidden seasons prepare you for visible moments. Joseph had no time to rehearse, but he was ready, standing before power. Imagine walking from a prison cell into the presence of Pharaoh. Gold, authority, influence, power structures at their peak. Joseph had not stood in a space like this before, yet he did not shrink. Pharaoh said, I have heard it said of you that you can interpret dreams. This was Joseph's moment. He could have taken credit. He could have seized personal glory. After years of obscurity, this was tempting. But listen to his response. I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. That's maturity. No ego. No self-promotion. Confidence, but grounded in humility. The hidden years had stripped arrogance. Now he could stand in power without being intoxicated by it. Clarity under pressure. Pharaoh explained the dreams. Joseph interpreted them calmly. 7 years of abundance. 7 years of severe famine. Not just symbolism, strategy. Joseph didn't stop at interpretation. He proposed a plan. Appoint a wise administrator. Store surplus during abundance. Prepare infrastructure. Manage distribution. He spoke like a governor, before he was one. That's capacity. Hidden seasons had trained him in systems. Potiphar's house had built administrative skill. Prison had built endurance. Now everything converged. The decision. Pharaoh turned to his advisors. Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Incredible. A foreigner. A former slave. A prisoner hours ago. Now being recognized for divine wisdom. Pharaoh didn't hesitate. You shall be in charge of my palace. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. In one day, Joseph went from prisoner to prime minister. That's not exaggeration. That's divine orchestration. The speed of restoration. We focus on the years of waiting, but we must also recognize the speed of fulfillment. When the moment arrives, it moves quickly. Robe placed on him. Signet ring given. Gold chain around his neck. Second chariot assigned. Clothing again. Notice the pattern. His brothers stripped his robe. Potiphar's wife held his cloak. Now Pharaoh robes him in authority. What was taken in betrayal is restored in elevation. But this time, the garment matches the maturity. Joseph was no longer a 17-year-old dreamer. He was a seasoned leader. The weight of authority. Authority is heavy, especially after trauma. Joseph now had power over resources, power over distribution, power over life and death during famine. He had the ability to control access to food, and famine was coming. This was not symbolic leadership. This was national survival. The hidden seasons had built more than skill. They had built restraint. Joseph knew what injustice felt like. He knew betrayal. He knew false accusation. That memory would protect him from abusing power. The years of abundance. For 7 years, Egypt prospered. Joseph implemented his plan. Storage cities built. Grain collected. Systems structured. He was proactive, not reactive. He didn't waste abundance. He prepared for scarcity. That's wisdom. And it reflects something deeper. Joseph had learned that seasons change. Plenty doesn't last forever. Neither does famine. Perspective like that only comes through suffering. The personal restoration. During those years, Joseph married. He had 2 sons. He named the first Manasseh. For God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. Not erase, but soften. The second he named Ephraim. For God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. That name is powerful. Fruitful, in suffering. Not after suffering. In it. Joseph didn't wait for ideal conditions to grow. He grew in Egypt. The place of betrayal became the place of blessing. The famine arrives. Then the famine hit. Severe. Widespread. Devastating. Nations came to Egypt for food, including Canaan, including his brothers. But that part comes next. For now, focus on this. Joseph stood where the dream had hinted. In authority, people bowed before him, not symbolically, literally. But notice something profound. When the dream manifested, Joseph didn't gloat. He didn't announce, "I told you so." He governed. Because dreams fulfilled feel different than dreams imagined. They carry weight, responsibility, sobriety, the inner shift. The sudden shift could have destabilized him. Power can intoxicate those who suffered. But Joseph had processed his pain. He had endured silence. He had passed integrity tests. He had matured. So when elevation came, he didn't lose himself. He stepped into it calmly. That's the mark of true preparation. The architecture of timing. Think about the orchestration. Brothers sell him. Traders transport him. Potiphar purchases him. Wife falsely accuses. Prison positions him near officials. Cupbearer forgets. Pharaoh dreams. Memory resurfaces. Every stage felt disconnected. But together, they formed a pathway. Nothing wasted. Not the pit. Not the prison. Not the silence. It all converged in one day. From reaction to rule. Joseph's life had been reactive for years. Reacting to betrayal. Reacting to slavery. Reacting to accusation. Now he moved into proactive leadership. No longer surviving. Governing. The shift wasn't just external. It was internal. He was no longer defined by what happened to him. He was defined by how he responded to it. The quiet triumph. The palace wasn't loud triumph. It was quiet fulfillment. Joseph didn't laugh at his past. He didn't erase it. He integrated it. Pain had become perspective. Delay had become discipline. Loss had become leadership. In a single day, prison doors opened. Chains removed. Garments changed. Authority given. But that day was built on years of hidden formation. Sudden shifts are rarely sudden in heaven's design. They are the visible tip of invisible preparation. Joseph went from prison to palace. Not because circumstances improved randomly, but because character had matured completely. And now, the dream was about to confront its origin. Because famine was spreading. And the brothers who sold him would soon stand before him. The shift had happened, but the story wasn't finished. The dream was about to return, face to face. The famine did not knock politely. It arrived like a slow tightening of the sky. The rain stopped. The soil cracked. The wind carried dust instead of life. Fields that once shimmered gold now stood brittle and gray. In Canaan, Jacob's household felt the hunger creeping in. First as concern, then as rationing, then as silence around the dinner table. There is a kind of hunger that gnaws at the stomach. And there is a kind that gnaws at memory. Joseph's brothers felt both. News traveled across lands like a whisper of hope. There is grain in Egypt. A governor had stored food during the years of abundance. People were traveling from distant nations to buy bread. Jacob gathered his sons, the same sons who had once stood around a pit and looked down at a brother begging for mercy. Go, he told them, buy grain for us. But Benjamin stayed home. Jacob would not risk losing another son of Rachel. The irony was sharp. They had once convinced him Joseph was dead, and now the youngest remained under heavy protection, because love once broken becomes overprotective. So 10 brothers set out toward Egypt. They traveled not as shepherd princes, but as desperate men. The journey was long. Each step carried dust and unspoken history. None of them said Joseph's name, but the name was there. It lived in glances, in pauses, in the way Reuben avoided Judah's eyes. Guilt has a sound. It is quiet, but heavy. They crossed borders. They entered the city of power. Egypt stood tall, granaries full, streets busy, authority structured, order in the middle of chaos. And at the center of it all sat a man they did not recognize. Joseph, not the boy in a coat of many colors, not the dreamer in a field, but a ruler dressed in linen and gold, bearing the signet of Pharaoh, fluent in Egyptian, controlled, composed. They saw authority. He saw faces. And in a single heartbeat, time folded. Joseph knew them instantly. Age had marked them, but memory sharpened recognition. The way Judah stood slightly forward. The familiar posture of Simeon. The tension in Reuben's shoulders. The men who sold him. The men who stripped him. The men who walked away while he cried. Now they stood before him as strangers. And they bowed. Not casually. Not symbolically. They bowed their faces to the ground. The dream came rushing back. Sheaves in a field bending low. 11 stars bowing down. What once sounded arrogant now stood fulfilled. But here's the twist. Joseph did not smile. He did not reveal himself. He did not rush into their arms. Because dreams fulfilled too quickly can bypass transformation. He needed to know something. Were they still the same men? Power is dangerous when combined with unresolved pain. Joseph had both. He could have punished them. He could have exposed them. He could have humiliated them publicly. Instead, he chose strategy. He spoke harshly, through an interpreter. Where do you come from? From Canaan, they answered. You are spies. The accusation startled them. They defended themselves quickly. No, my lord. We are honest men, sons of one father. One is no more, and the youngest remains with our father. One is no more. The phrase pierced Joseph like a blade. They believed he was dead, or at least, they had let their father believe it. Joseph held his composure. Emotion pressed against his ribs, but discipline kept it contained. He imprisoned them for 3 days. 3 days. Time in a confined space has a way of surfacing buried truth. On the 3rd day, Joseph offered a test. One brother would remain in custody. The rest would return home and bring back the youngest to prove their story. And then something happened that Joseph did not expect. They spoke to each other, thinking he could not understand. Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw his distress when he pleaded with us, and we did not listen. The past had not vanished. It had waited. Reuben added, Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? Joseph turned away. For the first time in years, he wept because of them. Not because of what they did, but because they finally felt it. Regret had found them. Guilt had matured into conviction. He chose Simeon and bound him before their eyes. The others returned to Canaan. And when they opened their sacks at night, they found their silver returned. Fear gripped them. What is this that God has done to us? Notice that shift. They did not say, What has Egypt done? They said, What has God done? Conscience had awakened theology. Back home, Jacob resisted sending Benjamin. The thought alone reopened wounds. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you would take Benjamin. Judah stepped forward. The same Judah who once suggested selling Joseph. I will be surety for him, he said. If I do not bring him back, let me bear the blame forever. Something had changed. Responsibility replaced indifference. The brothers returned to Egypt, with Benjamin. Joseph saw him from a distance. His full brother. Rachel's son. The child who shared his mother's eyes. Emotion surged again. He ordered a private chamber and wept violently. Then he washed his face and returned. Strength is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to carry it without losing direction. He invited them to dine. They were seated in birth order. Confusion spread among them. How could this ruler know? Benjamin received 5 times more food than the rest. A subtle test. Would jealousy rise again? Would resentment ignite? They did not protest. They did not compete. Growth had replaced rivalry. But Joseph was not finished. He ordered his silver cup placed in Benjamin's sack before their departure. A final test. When the cup was discovered, accusations fell upon them. Benjamin was declared guilty. He would remain as slave, and the others were free to go. This was the moment. Years ago, they abandoned one brother. Now they faced a choice. Leave Benjamin, or stand together. Judah stepped forward again, and what he said shattered Joseph's final wall. He recounted their father's grief. He spoke of the old man's attachment to Benjamin. He offered himself instead. Let me remain as slave in place of the boy. The brother who once profited from Joseph's sale now volunteered to suffer for another. Transformation was complete. Joseph could not restrain himself. He cleared the room. His voice broke as he wept loudly enough for the palace to hear. I am Joseph. The room froze. I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Silence. Shock. Fear. Their faces drained of color. But Joseph's next words redefined the entire narrative. Do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Sent, not sold. God's perspective rewrote their crime. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. In that moment, Joseph stood taller than any throne could make him. Forgiveness is the highest form of authority. He embraced Benjamin. He wept on Judah's neck. The famine had forced their return, but grace completed it. They bowed once in fear. Now they stood in reconciliation. And the dream? It was never about power. It was about positioning. God had not elevated Joseph to dominate his brothers. He elevated him to preserve them. Sometimes your return to old wounds is not to reopen pain, but to reveal purpose. The brothers left Egypt that day not as criminals exposed, but as a family restored. And Joseph? He learned something greater than dream fulfillment. He learned that the greatest victory is not rising above those who hurt you. It is lifting them up when you finally can. Revelation does not arrive in noise. It arrives in clarity. The room still carried the echo of Joseph's tears. The brothers stood frozen, suspended between disbelief and fear. The man before them, Egypt's governor, Pharaoh's right hand, the voice that controlled the nation's food supply, had just spoken the name they buried 20 years ago. I am Joseph. There are moments when the past returns so suddenly it steals the air from your lungs. This was one of them. The brothers' minds raced backward. A field in Dothan. A coat soaked in blood. Silver exchanged for silence. A father collapsing in grief. For 2 decades they had lived with the story of a wild animal. Now the truth stood dressed in linen and authority. And the most terrifying part? Joseph had power. Absolute power. He could imprison them. Execute them. Expose them to Pharaoh. Humiliate them publicly. This was the moment revenge stories are written from. But Joseph was not writing revenge. He was revealing perspective. Do not be distressed, he said. That sentence alone is astonishing. The victim comforting the offenders. Do not be angry with yourselves. Who says that? Who looks at the people who betrayed, sold, and erased them, and tells them not to drown in self-hatred? Someone who has seen something bigger. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Sent. Joseph did not deny their evil. He named it. You sold me. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not spiritualize it away. He did not pretend it was less than it was. But he placed their action inside a larger frame. You meant evil against me. Ownership. Accountability. Truth. But God meant it for good. Perspective. Providence. Purpose. Those 2 sentences contain one of the most powerful theological statements in all of Scripture. They do not cancel each other out. They coexist. Human intent can be evil. God's intent can be redemptive. At the same time, Joseph did not say, it wasn't evil. He said, God repurposed it. There's a difference. If Joseph had remained in Canaan, he would have been a shepherd among shepherds. If his brothers had applauded his dreams, he might never have left home. If the pit had not happened, the palace would not have either. If Potiphar's wife had not lied, he would not have met the cupbearer. If the prison had not confined him, Pharaoh's dream would not have reached him. If famine had not struck, his brothers would not have bowed. Every injustice became a junction. Every betrayal became a bridge. Every delay became positioning. Joseph continued, God sent me before you to preserve a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. In other words, this was never just about me. It was about survival. It was about generations. It was about a promise made to Abraham. It was about a nation not yet born. Joseph realized something profound. His suffering had been strategic. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It means it wasn't random. There's a dangerous misunderstanding about forgiveness, that it minimizes pain. Joseph's forgiveness did not shrink what happened. It magnified what God did through it. Forgiveness is not denial. It is decision. Joseph decided that bitterness would not sit on his throne. Imagine the internal journey required to say those words. Years in slavery. Years in prison. Years forgotten. He had time to rehearse anger. Time to replay the pit. Time to imagine revenge speeches. But somewhere between the prison floor and Pharaoh's palace, Joseph's heart healed. Not because time passed, but because perspective shifted. He began to see patterns, connections, divine fingerprints. When you only look at the pit, you see cruelty. When you step back and look at the path, you see orchestration. Joseph wasn't lucky. He was positioned. And positioning often feels like punishment while you're in it. The brothers stood speechless. Guilt had been their companion for 20 years. They expected exposure. Instead, they received explanation. So it was not you who sent me here, Joseph said, but God. That sentence must have shattered their understanding. They thought they were in control that day in Dothan. They thought they ended a dream. They thought they decided Joseph's fate. But Joseph now declared, you were not the final authority. There was a higher hand at work. This revelation does not excuse evil. It dethrones it. Evil is real, but it is not sovereign. Joseph invited them to bring their father to Egypt. You shall live in the land of Goshen, he said. I will provide for you. The provider once discarded now became the protector. The rejected son now secured the family's future. The dreamer once mocked now preserved the mockers. And here's the stunning part. Joseph did not leverage his position to demand apology before provision. He gave first. He restored first. He embraced first. He wept on Benjamin's neck again. He kissed all his brothers. Only after that did they begin to talk. Reconciliation requires someone brave enough to move first. Joseph moved. When Pharaoh heard the news, he supported it. Wagons were sent. Resources supplied. The family of Israel relocated to Egypt, not as refugees, but as honored guests. Back in Canaan, Jacob listened as his sons told him, Joseph is still alive. He did not believe them. Grief can make hope feel offensive. But when he saw the wagons, tangible evidence, the old man's spirit revived. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. And when father and son reunited, years of sorrow melted into tears of restoration. Joseph's revelation was not just theological. It was generational. Because of his perspective, bitterness did not pass to the next generation. Because of his forgiveness, a family did not fracture permanently. Because of his clarity, a nation survived famine. You meant evil against me. This part matters. Some people will hurt you. Some betrayals are intentional. Some pits are dug on purpose. Joseph does not deny that. But he refuses to let evil define the outcome. But God meant it for good. Not to make the pain pretty. Not to pretend it was easy. But to assert that God can take what was designed to destroy you and convert it into preservation. The cross centuries later would echo this same pattern. Humanity meant execution. God meant redemption. The worst act of injustice became the greatest act of salvation. Joseph's life was a preview of that pattern. Suffering redirected. Evil repurposed. Death transformed into deliverance. And here's the final layer of revelation. Joseph understood that the dream was never about dominance. It was about direction. His brothers bowed, but not so he could feel superior. They bowed because famine forced dependence. They bowed because provision stood before them. They bowed because the dream was about positioning Joseph where he could save them. Your elevation is not for ego. It is for assignment. Joseph could have spent his life trying to prove the dream. Instead, he lived in such a way that when the moment came, he was ready for it. Integrity in slavery. Faithfulness in prison. Wisdom in power. Forgiveness in revelation. That is the full arc. When Joseph said, "You meant evil," he acknowledged human freedom. When he said, "God meant it for good," he affirmed divine sovereignty. The two truths stand side by side. And somewhere between them is hope. Hope that your pit is not the end. Hope that betrayal is not the final chapter. Hope that delay is not denial. Hope that God's intention can outlast human cruelty. Joseph did not just interpret dreams. He interpreted history. He reread his own story and saw God in places he once felt abandoned. And that is the ultimate revelation. God was in the pit. God was in the slave market. God was in Potiphar's house. God was in the prison. God was in the palace. God was in the famine. God was in the reunion. The brothers walked into Egypt thinking they came for grain. They left with something far greater: understanding. And Joseph? He stood as living proof that what was meant to break you can become what builds others. You meant evil. Yes, but God meant it for good. And when you finally see that, bitterness loses its grip, revenge loses its appeal, and your story gains a purpose bigger than your pain.